Thank you everyone for joining this evening, and welcome to tonight's What is Wrong with Fast Fashion? And we'll be featuring, as Beth mentioned, new Trier students and some sustainable clothing brands as well. And we will be discussing the current state of the fashion industry, how clothes are made, what changes are being made in our community and beyond. I'd like to go ahead and take a few minutes to explain fast fashion for anyone who is not familiar or doesn't know. So it's a term used for clothes that are quickly made, quickly brought to market. Some of these clothing items may even cost as low as $1. And the trends, rather than even just seasonal or annual trends, could be as fast changing as quickly as every week. And so here are some examples of some of those brands. And what they represent is basically just a large amount of fabric being distributed all over the world. And I couldn't fit every fast fashion brand on here, but this just gives you some idea of maybe some brands that I know I've purchased clothes from. Maybe some of you are familiar as well with some of these brands. And let's see what else. There's also some luxury brands as well that maybe people don't consider, that could be that can use some of the same systems as well as these fast fashion brands, but maybe aren't traditionally known as fast fashion. And so part of what's happening now in the world and social media is that people are sharing on social media. They're buying all these fast fashion clothes, large boxes full of cheap clothes. They're trying them on, wearing them once or twice, sharing the 1 or 2 times they're wearing them on social media, and then throwing them out. So I just wanted to share a quick clip of what's happening on social media. So as you can see, some of these tops are $5 or $11, and this is what's happening. These are, buying 20 pieces of clothing at one time, trying them on, maybe wearing them once, and then throwing them out. So anyway, okay, you get the idea of what's happening, trending on social media, and what's happening with fast fashion. So now what the issues are, maybe even if you are not purchasing clothes from some of these brands, the issue that extends through much of the market that we're finding is it's a huge industry, and there's lots of complex pieces and parts and for how clothes are made. And it starts, something really interesting is that it's the third biggest manufacturing industry after automotive and technology. Textile production contributes more to climate change than international aviation and shipping combined. So it starts from the raw materials, from the fibers. And some issues are that most of the synthetic materials are actually made from oil. And nearly 70 million barrels of oil are used each year to make the world's polyester fiber, which is now the most commonly used fiber in our clothing. And it takes more than 200 years to decompose. Sorry. And so as you can tell, obviously this has huge environmental repercussions just from the point A of creating the clothes, and then with cotton as well. Cotton that is not organic has a lot of pesticides that need to be used to make it. And then once you have these fibers, then you need to spin and weave them and dye them, and dyeing as well can be full of lots of toxic chemicals. And then another issue in the process is then you have to go and turn this fabric into a product. And the conditions in a lot of these factories around the world are really unsafe. And it's a human rights issue, a women's rights issue. In fact, 80% of the people making our clothing are young women ages 18 to 24, and most of them earn less than $3 a day. So this is just a small, touching just the tip of the iceberg, even within fast fashion, some of the issues that you can see. And then, so once you go ahead and you've gone through the companies have gone through all this effort, have made the clothes, shipped it to you, or you went to the store and purchased it, and then you've worn it hopefully more than twice, but then let's say it's no longer usable, or stained or torn or whatever. Now it's time to dispose of your clothes, and that's another issue that we see that impacts the environment. And unfortunately, Americans on average, we're only recycling about 15 to 20% of our clothing. And then from there, a small portion may end up in thrift shops domestically. And another small portion, it can be turned into industrial rags, insulation, mattress and carpet pads. But then another large portion of secondhand clothes ends up in Africa and has unfortunately collapsed cloth manufacturing industries within some African countries, because they would, rather than create their own garments, purchase a $1 secondhand t-shirt from America. So, and then for anything else that's not recycled, of course, it ends up in a landfill. And unfortunately, there's also very large implications, and we shouldn't have, hopefully we can end this at some point to not have any fabric end up in landfill, but 80% of all clothes end up in landfills. And that obviously contributes a lot to global warming. Anyway, so that's a quick introduction to, I'll stop sharing my screen here. Quick introduction to fast fashion for those who maybe don't have a background in that. And I'd love to turn it over to focus on, first we're going to focus on local efforts of how we're trying to make changes in our community here in the North Shore of Chicago regarding fashion. And then we'll have a panel discussion. We're going to bring in some additional panelists to talk about the industry as a whole. And so I wanted to hand it over to our new Trier students from their local environmental club. There is hope, I think, knowing that these students really want to make a difference, and even built a circular fashion system at their school. So I'm very impressed with what they've done, and love to hear more from them about their project.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. So hi, I'm Charlotte Culkins, and I'm a new Trier student. And today we'll be talking.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah, sorry. And today we'll be talking about our project about fast fashion. Go ahead, Claire. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, you're all good. Hi, I'm Claire. I am a senior at Nature, and Charlotte and I are co-heads of the environmental club.
Yes, and Dimitrio is a club open to all students where we discuss local and global environmental issues, and we plan and carry out projects to increase the awareness and sustainability, particularly within our school. And one of our big projects for the winter this year was a collaboration with Nutri's school store to create a resale option for students for school merchandise and provide resources and information on the costs of fast fashion.
And so first, to help us explain our project, we have a bunch of our club members here with us. So Sarah is a sophomore, and she's going to start us off.
Hi, I'm Sarah. So one reason that we decided to take on a project about fast fashion was because we recognize that the people at our school and members of our generation as a whole are particularly prone to participating in fast fashion. Generally, we tend to be an environmentally conscious generation, yet a Vogue business survey of Gen Z shows otherwise. More than half of the respondents reported buying their clothes from fast fashion brands. We also chose outweigh other generations in fast fashion purchases. Data from the market research firm Mintel suggests that 64% of 16 to 19-year-olds admit to buying clothes that they have never worn compared to 44% of adults. Most teens are aware that fast fashion is bad. However, they do not usually feel the need to look into the details of the industry or that the problem is too big to be solved. Companies market to the teen demographic through advertisements on social media platforms like Instagram and TikTok. Users don't have to intentionally browse for clothes. They use social media and see these ads. Their feeds frequently enforce the idea to buy from such advertisements, influencers, or even their peers. For example, there are many videos on TikTok of Shein and hauls from influencers with over 24 billion views total. When we surveyed students at Trier, we found some similar results. 86% of respondents said that they had purchased clothing and only worn it once or never. Also, about 2/3 of respondents never or only occasionally considered the environmental footprint of brands that they bought clothes from. And only 14% of respondents regularly consider the environmental impact of fabrics. We wanted to increase understanding about the harm caused by the fashion industry that we were supporting, but even more importantly, show people the many fun and fashionable alternatives to purchasing cheap and new clothing. Through this process, we also learned more about how fast fashion is impacting the world right now, which Aiden will explain briefly now.
Hello, as Sarah mentioned, my name is Aiden, and I'm a junior at Nutria. So on a more global level, fast fashion is a relevant topic today because of the pandemic, which has damaged global supply chains and has also caused a growth in online shopping, which has caused supply chains to backorder clothing and to overload, which is not good for the workers who produce these garments, because most workers who do not receive their pay until the clothing that they made is delivered to the consumer. And because of this, workers are being laid off, or they're not receiving as much pay as they were before the pandemic. But because of the backed up supply chain, people are now turning towards more secondhand clothing options, like thrifted clothing, which reduces the environmental impact that clothing has on the world. So there is an upside from the global pandemic with an increase in thrifting, but yet a downside with online shopping, which harms the environment through the CO2 emissions from the transportation and shipping of those clothes.
So we brainstormed some ways that we could help from our corner of the world, and we ended up creating a fast fashion project that consisted of 3 parts, which were creating the Trevian Exchange, making and displaying an art piece with a message about fast fashion, and building and distributing a website with lots of resources for students in the community, which we will share with you guys at the end. So the first thing we did was we collaborated with the One Stop Trev Shop, which is a school merchandise shop that also helps give employment experience to students in our special education program. And we wanted to help them create a rack in the school store that would resell Nutria gear that people had outgrown or no longer wanted at reasonable prices for students. And so Environmental Club created posters and announcements encouraging people to donate the gear that they were no longer using. And we also designed reusable tumblers as a prize for a raffle that students could enter if they donated. And after a few weeks, we had collected a lot of clothing items. And so we helped run a thrifting week in the One Stop Trev Shop, where students could not only browse the newly stocked Trevian exchange, but they could also learn about fast fashion. And Claire will explain the outfit that we built to display during this week.
Yeah, so we took donations from students who were in the club who had clothes that they were planning on throwing out, just so that we could keep things contained because of COVID. We couldn't really touch too many clothes from like other students, but all of the clothes were from fast fashion companies, like pretty famous ones. We had some Urban Outfitters, Forever 21, a lot of it. And it was a mix of different fabrics. Some were easier to cut up than others, but we cut them all into squares and we tried to use as much of the fabric that we could without wasting anything. We were even like cutting buttons off. If you look at the mannequin in the middle, we named her Penelope. She has button eyes and like a trendy little nose ring. And it was the goal was just to make a dress or a skirt, and then we attach it to this shirt that you can see in the middle. So Charlotte and I went to the makerspace that was in our library, and we just really discovered how little we know about sewing. We took up like half our time just to try to figure out how to work the sewing machine, and it's way harder than it looks. We had to end up using hot glue, but we gained a lot of appreciation for people who make clothing, and got some insight into that. So we made this little patchwork skirt for our mannequin and the matching tank top. And it turned out really well, and we were really proud of it. So we're gonna have Jules, who is a junior in the club, explain more about the resources that we provided.
Hi, I'm Jules. So for part of this project, we also created a Nutria Environmental Club website. And the website basically has a bunch of different resources for people to learn about the negative impacts of the apparel industry and the impacts on the planet. It also has tips about what fabrics are best to look for and for how to keep your clothing from shredding microplastics in the washing machine. And if you want to check out the website, you can scan the QR code here. And we also have information about sustainable businesses, including Retrofit, whose owner is going to talk later.
And also we will provide a link to the website after the webinar. So if you didn't get it, don't worry, if you didn't get the QR code. So now that our thrift week is over, we still want to continue to encourage students to make informed, sustainable, and equitable decisions when buying clothes. So we plan on donating a portion of the proceeds from the thrifting week to a Hong Kong-based organization working globally with businesses to reduce waste in the fashion industry. And you can learn more about them at our website. And the Trevian Exchange will continue to run in the One Stop Trev Shop. And we may very well make the Thrifting Week an annual event. We'll see next year. And finally, we started this project from scratch, and it definitely wasn't easy. So we hope that we can share our experience and our resources with other schools that may be interested in creating a resale shop in their buildings. So if any of you guys listening here today are interested to learn more about this project, we hope that you will contact us. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Barbara Ruiz. Barbara is an entrepreneur in the fashion and retail industry. She currently owns and operates upcycled sustainable fashion studio and boutique Retrofit in Evanston. Her extensive experience in fashion design and retail has driven her interest in shrinking the environmental footprint of the fashion and apparel industry with a local focus. Retrofit is also a member of the Evanston Made Arts Cohort. Barbara first got involved when she opened Lincoln Square, Chicago boutiques, The Dressing Room and The Dressing Room Shoes in 2005, as well as children's boutique City Mouse in 2006. She also spent a decade working as a wardrobe stylist on advertising shoots throughout Chicago. Ruiz studied fashion design at Columbia College in Chicago and currently lives in Evanston with her husband, Steve, 3 grown children, and dog, Pablo Picasso.
Hi, everyone. Let me see, start sharing screens. Thank you so much for inviting me. I am Barbara Ruiz from Retrofit Studio in Evanston. Let me see if I can share this. Some slides. I consider myself, can you all hear me? Okay. I consider myself to be in fast fashion recovery. And I am pretty much here just to talk about a little bit about my background, where I came from, the part that I played in fast fashion, and what I'm doing now with my studio in Evanston, Retrofit. I moved to Chicago and studied art and fashion, did a lot of wardrobe styling, got married, had 3 little kids. And when my youngest child was about a year old, I opened my first boutique in Chicago, which was kind of a dream of mine. At that time, you know, it was the early to mid 2000s. I was traveling a lot. I eventually opened up three stores in a pretty short amount of time. But at that time, I was also traveling with my family a lot and going to Europe to visit my husband's family. And I'll be honest, one of my favorite parts of traveling was that I could go to these big stores. Think late 90s, early 2000s. Some of you kids may laugh about this, but H&M, all of the ones that were on the first screenshots, H&M, Zara, Topshop. I loved going into these stores. They weren't in the States yet. They looked so cool to me. They had endless racks of clothing, seemingly hundreds, thousands of pieces of clothing, all different, all exciting. And, you know, I would leave with bags of clothes for maybe spending about the same amount of money as you'd spend on one item at a boutique somewhere. So I always thought it was a bit of a win for me, you know, to be able to go to Europe and shop at these stores, and they came to the US, and I still thought that was great. So I'd come back from trips, go back to work in my boutiques, which for me meant going to buying shows, buying clothes to sell in my shops. In my scope, you know, the life of the clothes sort of began when it came into my store, and it ended when it walked out the door. And I really didn't even have any frame of reference. I didn't give any thought to what happened to those garments before they got to me. Where were they made? How were they made? What are they made of? Who made them? So, you know, these were not even questions that I even had the scope to even think to ask. And then on the flip side, the clothes would walk out the door, and, you know, I would think, happy customer, nothing else, it's done. Well, you know, I didn't think, are these things that someone will value for years? Will they come back next week, just buy another outfit, which they often did? You know, so it was sort of this very narrow view of what I did, and what I really enjoyed in the beginning that changed when I started toward the end. I closed my last store in 2013, right around when we moved to Evanston. It changed because I started being sort of introduced to more little indie, small, local lines, designers who were using language that I wasn't familiar with in my world of retail. They were saying things like, you know, sustainable fabric and eco-friendly dyes and, you know, fair wages. And these things are not words that I heard when I would go to the big shows in New York and Las Vegas. So it was a really, you know, a little bit of information that came to me little by little. And what happens when you get a little information, you know, I never had a big lightning strike epiphany moment, but what I had was more like a death by 1,000 cuts. And, you know, what happens when you get a little data and all that data is like really bad, is that, you know, you want to make a change. So, you know, the one big super sexy headline that everyone has seen, and probably everyone here knows, is that according to the United Nations, we have about 10 years left to prevent irreversible damage from climate change. That's the big one, right? Super daunting, super bleak, really scary. And it really feels like as individuals and as people, it just doesn't seem like we can do anything about it. There are too many of us, and we have too many different things to think about. We're too different. But I would say that as people, and I mean all people, I mean every person on earth, and regardless of the things that we think separate us, things like political affiliation or religion or nationality, every person has one thing in common, and that is if you ask someone what the most important thing to them is, typically almost 100% of the time, they will say their people, their children, their family, the people in their life that they want to see a future for. As a mother, if you ask me what I would do for my children, it's an easy answer. And I think most people would agree with me. And that is anything. I would do anything for my kids. And I would go so far as to say, I would take a bullet for my kids. And it sounds dramatic, but when I think about this global climate crisis that we're in, this is the time that I propose to everyone that this is the bullet that we need to take for the people that we love so that they can have a future on this world that we're trying so hard to save right now. So how? What do we do? We're just talking about fast fashion today. So, that's sort of one little piece of the pie. And certainly the big companies need to take up a much bigger piece of that pie. But as individuals, there are things that we can do to change. I'm starting, I have a couple different areas. I would say there's one area of quitting fast fashion that is, stop shopping, just shop less. And then there's the other area that is it okay to shop? Like, yes, it's okay. I believe that it's okay to shop if you're shopping ethically and doing it right and asking yourself the right questions. So I'm actually going to move up. I'm sorry, I'm not using these slides. Can you see these slides? I hope so. So is it okay to buy new clothing? I believe that it is okay to buy new in certain instances if you're asking yourself the right questions. Some questions that you should be asking certainly are, who made this? Where was it made? What's it made of? Was it made ethically? And then a really important question that we need to start asking, how often will I wear this garment? I'm going to come back to that in a bit. These are some of the lines that I carry in my shop right now. I do carry new items. They're all made out of completely recycled materials or dead stock. I only have one line of dead stock and the rest is all recycled materials. Things like recycled military tents, fabric made from plastic bottles, old jeans. And then I like to also specifically carry lines that are owned by women, specifically one called Malia Designs, who is, the line is owned by a woman in Evanston, who I know personally, and I know that she knows the people who make her products personally. So for me to be one step away from the people who are, making the products that I sell in my store is something that I just didn't have in my early days of retail. And it's very important to me in how I'm modeling my retail today. The other way of shopping, of just changing shopping habits, is just shopping secondhand. And for my money, that is the best way to go. I think secondhand is the best thing we can do if we're going to shop. I would say there are ways to shop that do not sacrifice, or I would say there are habits we can change that don't sacrifice who we are. I love fashion. I like trends. I'm not embarrassed to say it. I like to shop. And there are ways that we can sort of not have to give up the joy of shopping. And secondhand shopping is one of those really easy things that we can do. And being on the North Shore of Evanston, we have a ton of great options. I think there is sort of a better way and a less good way to do secondhand. And the first thing to always try to shop locally when it comes to secondhand. So if you're shopping at your small community resale shop, a couple of things are going to be or will happen that won't happen if you're shopping at what I would consider to be, the big box, the Goodwills and the Salvation Armies of the world, which do have good items, not just clothing, but a couple of things will not happen that do occur when you shop in your community, local mom and pop resale shop. Those things are, often those stores will partner with the community in some ways. Often they give back to the community in some ways. And another thing that's very important is that something like 60 to 70 cents on the dollar will stay in your community when you spend your money in your community. So that's just one thing. You can sort of look at it as sort of, start local, and you can branch out from there. And the third is obviously shopping online. There are lots of online options, obviously, and they'll be in this. I mean, I think at the end we'll have some sites as well. So another thing. So when we talk about not shopping, the one thing to shop, a way to shop less is to, some people call it shop your closet. My husband calls it a try-on party because it looks like that's what's happening when I go through mine. But it's simple, and it's sort of a little bit of a Maria Kondo of, see what still brings you joy in your closet. Go through every article of clothing that you have and try it on. That's the important part. Try it on. A couple of things I will guarantee you will happen. You will forget that you had clothes that you like, not that you pushed aside because they don't fit or they're not in season or they're not trending, but things that you just didn't see because you have so many clothes that they were covered by the rest of your clothes. A couple other things will happen. You'll realize that you don't wear certain things, and it's time to get rid of those in some way, to friends, to family, or donating at some point. We wear about 20% of our clothes about 80% of the time. Just going through our clothes can help us find some new items. We really need to normalize wearing our clothes more often. Rethinking new versus old. 33% of women now consider their clothing old if they've worn them 3 times. Livia Firth of EcoAge recommends using, and this is where I go back to asking yourself those questions. It's called the 30 wears rule. Ask yourself before you buy anything, how many times will I wear this? If you can see yourself wearing that item 30 times or more, it's sort of worthy of buying or having. It's important now, times like now, because this season is fundraising season, especially here on the North Shore. I have 3 fundraisers in the next 3 weeks. At one time in my life, I would have bought 3 separate dresses, brand new, for 3 different events. It'll be wedding season. I mean, these are all items that we buy for a single use purpose. And that's what we need to sort of learn to stop doing. We need to just condition ourselves to rewear our clothing a lot more than we normally do now. Another thing is upcycling. I hope you can see this. It's something that I do every day at work at Retrofit. It's the main thing that I do. It's the main thing that I sell. I do take secondhand clothing, and I use typically secondhand or repurposed fabric, and I'm even using secondhand notions at this point, and even tools. So it's really important to me that I try to use as much as I can that's already existing. Taking apart, adding to, I reclaim and use pounds and pounds of fabric to just sort of make new items out of old items. It's something that I do because it's something that I kind of need to do as an artist, but it's something that anyone can do. You can take a dress that's a maxi dress and turn it into a mini skirt, or if you want short sleeves or no sleeves. I mean, it's a really simple thing. And if you don't personally sew, it's an easy fix. You can have a dry cleaner or a tailor do for you. Another thing in the shopping less, not shopping, is, swap parties. And this is something that I've done since I was probably in my 20s. And if you young people don't know about this, it's something that I highly recommend. And you should go home tonight and call all your friends and plan one, because it's super fun and it's easy. And it's this: get your favorite people, get all the clothes you don't wear, throw them in a pile, maybe get some snacks. And we would go around the circle and each person would get to choose one item. I would say it's even more fun for young people now because clothes are getting to be like genderless. You can have so many more options. So it's great fun. You usually end up with a little pile that you'll sort of donate at the end, but you will go home with some new to you items. Some of them might be like the sweater you've been coveting on your best friend for 5 years, but she's tired of. So, it's all win-win. Another thing that we need to do in terms of not shopping or shopping less, we have lost sight of the skill of mending. We need to get used to mending our clothes again. You don't need to know how to sew. You don't need to do it yourself. You just need to be willing to wear your clothes longer and not trashing them and deciding that they're landfill when you get a stain or a snag or a hole in something. And it doesn't matter what quality of clothing you have. It's something that you really need to be committed to doing. You can have beautiful clothes that are very expensive and very high quality, and you will walk past a nail or sit on something and need to mend your clothes. So, often a good dry cleaner or tailor can do it for you. If it's something that you can learn to do, even better. And talking about good quality versus bad quality, I do want to just kind of throw this in as someone who rips every type of clothing apart every day. We call fast fashion cheap a lot. I mean, it's just considered sort of like cheap clothing because it is considered disposable by so many people. And I will say, it's certainly produced in a low cost way, and it's sold to us at very low cost. But a lot of times these garment workers are professionals who are incredibly skilled. And the clothing that I'm taking apart or using, and a lot of it is, from Forever 21 to, higher end. Some of these items are incredibly well made. So I wouldn't discount any of the fast fashion that's already sitting in your closet, or any of those articles of clothing that you can buy secondhand that might be fast fashion, because there's a very good chance that it's pretty darn well made and you can wear it for years to come still. We're all here, educating ourselves and putting this all into practice together. And a couple of the things I do at my shop in the workshop is that I do classes. Right now I do classes for children, for teenagers. When I do the kids classes, we use all recycled materials and make dolls and do little things for children. We're making bedroom decor out of old clothing and things right now. And I always sneak in kind of a little like a lesson. Teen classes I do not, because they know more than me. So I usually get schooled by teenagers for sure. But one exciting thing that we're doing, and it's coming up on April 13, and I hope some of you will be interested in this, is that I'm doing my first book club. We'll meet at the shop. And we're reading this wonderful book by Aja Barber, and I recommend it to everyone at all ages here. It reads very interesting. I listen to books because I need my eyes and hands to sew all day, and it's fun to listen to. The author reads it. It's a fantastic book, and she comes at the issue of fast fashion from all areas. So she does talk about the climate crisis, but she also talks about feminism, sexism in general, colonialism. So all facets of why fast fashion is really terrible, and the garment industry in particular. So that's basically it. I had talked about taking this bullet in this grand sense about, this crisis seems so terrible, and it seems like we need to do something really dramatic and change all of our many of our habits. But when we're just talking about fast fashion and ditching fast fashion, it's really more like dodging a bullet, because it's not so hard. And there are so many really good alternatives, including here on the North Shore, including groups like this where we can get together and discuss and sort of exchange ideas. So with that, I'm going to let you go. And thank you so much again for inviting me to be a part of the panel.
Thank you very much, Barbara. That was really great. And to all the Nutria students, and it's, as you said, it's can feel daunting and to know what's happening, but also it's great to see so many people making such an effort to really change out the way that we're doing things. So I'm going to go into I'd like to bring in some panelists who are here as well, some more panelists, and then please continue if you do have any additional questions. Feel free to submit those and we'll do our best to get to them. But I'd like to introduce both Jenny Demetrio and Rachel Fowler, who will be joining our panel. I'll go ahead and start with Jenny Demetrio, who's the Chicago area Patagonia store manager. And she has some great information about how big brands like Patagonia are handling the current situation.
Thanks, Carolyn. Hi, I'm Jenny Demetrio. I actually work for Patagonia customer service remote, but I was the Patagonia store manager. And yeah, I'm here to talk a little bit about Patagonia's background and share some things that might be of interest in this subject. So our core values are to build the best product, to cause no unnecessary harm, and to use business to protect nature. And our overall mission is to save our home planet. Our goal is to use only recycled and renewables for fabric. That would be any natural material that can be grown or harvested on an annual basis, like wool or organic cotton. So to use only renewable or recycled by 2025. Some of the things that we do to combat combat climate change and to be anti-fast fashion is we guarantee everything we make, and we prioritize durability because that results in consuming less energy and wasting less water. We also have a worn wear program. So we accept used clothing, and if it's in good condition, you can trade it in so that you can get new Patagonia clothing, and then that way somebody that really wants it could buy it. We also really encourage repairing. We say that repairing is a radical act. So we do offer free repairs for any Patagonia product for as long as it's in the world. And we also encourage people to repair at home, and we send free trims if you want to repair at home, we send free trims to do that and free repair kits. Let's see, we also work with Blue Sign System, and that's basically a supply chain system that works to make sure that products are approved to be safe for the environment, workers, and consumers. We'd use recycled polyester, nylon, wool, down, and hemp. And Patagonia first started using organic cotton in 1996. I'm just kind of showing you some of the things you can look and find on our website that gives a really great extensive look at how we work to work towards these values. But as far as the organic cotton goes, it was an interesting story. The workers in the Boston store were actually getting headaches from the conventional cotton, the formaldehyde and things that were on the clothing. So Patagonia started looking at how that was made, and it took a really long time, and the company wasn't sure they were going to make it financially, but they switched over to all organic cotton in 1996, which was really radical at that point. And they took a lot of field trips to the conventional cotton farms in California to show everybody why it was so important, everybody that worked for the company, why it was so important to switch over to organic cotton. And once people got to see it for themselves and see the pesticides and just the working conditions for the workers, they decided to make the long switch to organic cotton. And then Patagonia also, let's see, out of our spring 2022 line, 722 styles are fair trade certified. That's 84% of our product line. So fair trade certification. So basically every product sold for the company pays an additional premium that goes directly to the worker in the worker managed account. So they can use that money on scholarships, community projects, medical care. They could also vote to take the premium as a cash bonus. But the company is working really, really hard on that. and getting that to 100%. But right now we're at 84%. And one thing that's really cool that I wish all brands did was the fact that you can go to a I'm trying to get to the page, sorry. Go to a product page and you can shop and see, obviously this is one of our best selling items. And then you can go all the way to the bottom and see where it was made. It gives you an overview. This little, obviously it's recycled and then it has a fair trade emblem, but you can view the impact. So you can see how it's made and where it's made, and you can follow the journey along. It'd be really cool if obviously every other big company did that, because it's a lot of transparency and it encourages just people to know where their clothing comes from, which we've heard already is so important. So thanks so much for listening. And it's a big topic, so I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you very much, Jenny, as well. And so I'm curious to hear, I'd like to hear from Rachel Fowler as well. She's founder, designer, CEO, right, of a company called Tonle. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'll let you jump in here as well. But it's a zero waste fashion brand, and she's got a lot of really great experience, background in the industry, in fashion industry, and then as well seeing different conditions around the world. And I'd like to, you of course can give a little introduction, but I do have a question for you that I'd like to know if anybody here watched the True Cost documentary. They highlighted a tragedy in 2013 where there was a collapse of a garment building in Bangladesh that unfortunately killed 1,132 garment workers. And I'd love to hear, Rachel, what your perspective is on, have there been any changes in the industry, especially for the conditions of these garment workers? And do we see some changes happening, and how can we look for those things when we're looking for clothing brands to support?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate the diverse range of perspectives that are on this panel. It's actually like a really good compliment. It was funny, actually. So Barbara's store carries the line Malia. I also know the founder of Malia, and I also know the makers of Malia. So that is a really cool small world story. And I recognize some of the other makers from your deck as well, Barbara. So that was cool to see. But yeah, I think to get into your question, I'll give you a little background about myself and how I got involved in the fashion industry and how I came to be where I was when that tragedy happened. And some of the other tragedies I witnessed before that and after that have not been received that coverage. To answer your question in broad strokes, I would say, unfortunately, no, I don't think the industry as a whole is improving. I think it's actually getting worse, and it's gotten significantly worse during the pandemic. And I think that as much as people are talking about sustainability and talking about ethical fashion, the vast majority of the fashion industry is still very far behind what people are talking about and what customers want, I think. And because the narrative is so much controlled by the brands, they don't have an incentive to tell these stories, right? And they're also in a position of power. They're buying from these factories in other places with workers who sometimes don't have access to technology or to go on the internet themselves and talk about what they're experiencing. Brands also control the press. They pay for placements in PR. And so I don't think we've ever gotten the real story of what is going on from the actual workers and from the factories and manufacturers and farmers in a broader perspective. And so even though, yes, brands are making, somewhat tokenizing sustainability efforts, it's not radically changing. And at the same time, you know, you have these incremental sustainability improvements. At the same time, you also have production continuing to exponentially grow. And so, you know, you have a niche group of small brands who are really trying to do things 100%, and you have the other 99% that is 99% bad and maybe 1% good, and they're spending all their time talking about the 1% of good. So it's very misleading. So I would say, I think sustainability and ethics in fashion is much more in the public consciousness, but I think that there's a lot of systemic problems that are keeping us from actually being able to make real change. And I'll get into that for sure when we get into the Q&A. But just to give a little bit about my background, I think, you know, it's really inspiring to hear from students and just seeing how you're getting into this journey so early, which I think is super exciting. When I was in high school, I was also actually like upcycling my clothes and buying things from thrift stores and sewing them myself and doing kind of like DIY clothing making, which is kind of, you know, very, even stylistically a bit similar to what you were showing. And, you know, that was around the year 2000. So it was kind of like punk rock DIY scene. And through doing that, I like realized very quickly, like, there's no way you can make a piece of clothing and charge this much for it and have it be a fair price. And also, like, my first entry point into this was actually like as a young kid in the early 90s when the sweatshop protests were going on against Nike. That was, and Kmart, those were the two big ones. And there were these huge, huge protests. That was sort of like the first backlash against sort of this outsourced fashion production. And I was a kid at the time, and I remember thinking, like, these are kids my age who are making these things, right? And for some reason that really like incensed me, especially because I was making things myself, right? I was like an 8-year-old and I was learning how to sew, and I was watching these images of 8-year-olds in Vietnam making shoes. And so I think from that point, I was like, I can not go into fashion, even though I actually enjoyed making things. But when I went to college, I studied textile design, and it was more from a fine art perspective. When I went to college, I kind of had this realization, like, hey, if no one's going to do anything about it, like, it's just going to continue being bad. I can't just protest on the sidelines. Like, I have to get involved and use my skills to change this. And so that was really, like, I think sustainability and fair trade were very, like, kind of nascent at that time. There was definitely like a big fair trade movement, but it wasn't really making its way into like mainstream fashion. So I actually applied for a fellowship and went to Cambodia to research fair trade and sustainability. And what was really fascinating about that is Cambodia at the time was also where fast fashion production really started to increase. And also, like, it was 2008 when I moved there. And the recession was actually really what catapulted fast fashion. And so I lived in Cambodia from 2008 to through 2014. And then since then, I've been going back and forth. And I saw the rise of fast fashion through the lens of garment manufacturing, through the lens of workers, through the lens of the waste that was winding up in giant piles in essentially remnant markets in Phnom Penh. And after that first year of research, I was working with a lot of different artisans and makers and learning what was working for them. And I just saw there was this big divide between, you know, small scale artisan production and then these massive factories that were starting to churn out huge amounts of garments. And this increased pressure on workers to produce faster, to produce more styles. And their pay would often get docked if they couldn't produce it correctly, but they were never given training on how to do that. It was just like, okay, now you're going to produce more and more and more. And yeah, we'll pay you like marginally more, but you know, the conditions actually, even though workers were maybe getting paid more, and the wages, you know, the minimum wage when I moved there was $60 a month. And it went up to, now it's 170. So it's gone up by a lot, but $170 a month is still like absolutely like not a living wage. So kind of seeing how, yeah, in some ways the conditions are supposedly getting better, but because of this extra pressure to produce more and more and more, there's more waste, there's more negative impacts of toxic pollution, there's more air pollution, there's more river pollution. When you're there, you see it and you feel it and you live in it. It affected my health. I had breathing problems. Like, I mean, it's very visceral. So, you know, during that time, the amount of garment production worldwide actually doubled. And so Cambodian production was going up and up and up. They're producing faster and faster. And, you know, workers were, and there were massive worker tragedies in Cambodia as well. There was a whole series of actually mass faintings in H&M, in factories that were producing for H&M. And it was actually because of the chemicals, including formaldehyde, that were sprayed on the fabrics. And also because it was hot and people were underfed. People, you know, you'd have these young women who are like not eating enough food and standing for like 15 hours at a time in hot conditions, and they would faint, and then they would see their friends faint and other people would faint. And so there would be like 200 people in a factory that would all faint at the same time. And this was happening before the Rana Plaza collapse. And, you know, but people just like really weren't paying attention. You know, it was just like, again, because what's the incentive to get this story out there? Like H&M wants to keep that quiet. The brands who are manufacturing in these factories want to keep that quiet. So meanwhile, during this time, I started out making my own brand because I didn't really see like anything in the market that I wanted to buy for myself that I would wear. And I just started working with a small team of women and producing clothes out of the waste that was being thrown away by these larger brands. And over time, we developed a fully zero waste production model. We run our own production, which is really unique for brands. Most brands outsource their production to other factories. And I think that's one of the things that contributes to kind of the fundamental unfairness in the industry, because essentially, because the workers don't actually work for the brand doesn't have any fiscal or legal responsibility to those workers. So they can easily say, hey, like, and this is what happened in the Rana Plaza collapse. All the brands that were producing in that factory, they didn't own the factory and they didn't directly employ those workers. So they could easily say like, hey, it's not our fault. We had this policy, the factory wasn't adhering to it. But ultimately the brands are the ones who are deciding upon the structures that incentivize the factories, right? They're not paying enough per piece. They're also paying really, in really bad terms, like they don't pay in advance. They often pay 60 days after an order is delivered, as was mentioned on the panel with the students. And so as a result, the factories are really in a tenuous position. And that is what leads to a lot of these crises. And at the end of the day, the brand can walk away and say, it's not our fault. And so when the Rana Plaza collapsed, it was basically a subcontracted factory. The brands were essentially producing with a certain factory, and then that factory was actually outsourcing to the Rana Plaza. So the Rana Plaza, like itself, couldn't really be, it was really hard to hold them accountable. But also the brands, it was really hard to hold the brands accountable because the brands were just like, well, it's not our fault. And so after some time, there was a lot of activist pressure, and they did get some of the brands to pay into a fund to compensate the families of the workers. And then later there was an accord that was passed called the Bangladesh Accord, which is a pretty landmark regulation. It's an agreement between the factories, the factory worker, the unions, and the brands. But my problem with this, right, is that it all is about kind of compliance. Like the brands can basically go and say, hey, we have these rules that you need to follow, and you need to like sign these documents that say you're going to follow these rules. If the factory doesn't comply, the brand will actually punish them for not complying by like taking away orders or whatever. But the thing is, there's no way for the factory to actually put pressure back on the brand and say, hey, you're not paying us enough, and you're not giving us good terms, because if they do that, the brand will just go somewhere else. And so ultimately, like, I think that changes that need to happen have to be on a really systemic level. Like, for example, like a US corporation, its workers are very protected in the US by our corporate laws and by our trade regulations. But a US corporation that's manufacturing in Cambodia or Bangladesh, because those factory workers are not their workers, they don't have to give those workers the same protections. And I think that a US corporation should absolutely be responsible to offer the same protections to the workers who are making their products as they do to their workers in the US at the very minimum. The workers in the US aren't even treated fairly either. So that's like a whole other thing. But you know, outsourcing was directly connected to labor rights getting better in the US. When labor rights started to get better in the US for workers here, that's when brands started outsourcing their production. So it's not actually just about the pay, it's also about the conditions and the risk that they're offsetting into these other countries, and also the ability to pollute the environment with impunity. A lot of the chemicals that are used in these factories are not even allowed to be handled by workers in America, because we have OSHA and things that protect workers and protect the environment, but an American corporation can do that in another country. So I think that at the end of the day, there definitely needs to be more regulation and more through trade policy, through corporate policy, and you know, both on the environmental side and on the social side, because American corporations are essentially able to go around the world and act however they want. And a really good example of this is that like Jeff Bezos's net worth alone is 7 times the entire GDP of Cambodia, of the country of Cambodia. And their major export is garments. So essentially, if you think about it, it's like, how can an entire country stand up to these fashion companies, right? And Amazon makes a huge amount of its money through fashion. And so how can an entire country that has that kind of power dynamic against them, how can they stand up to that, right? If the government of Cambodia increases their wages, they know that these corporations will just go to other countries. I've literally heard people in the industry say, oh, Ethiopia is the new frontier because it doesn't have a minimum wage. So anyway, long story short, Tonle is trying to change that. We are a smaller brand. We have about 50 people that are employed full-time with fair wages and benefits. But most importantly, I think that we are setting a standard that things can be done differently, that workers' rights, environmental justice have to go hand in hand. And you know, you can't. I think ultimately, like, all of this comes back to power dynamics. And so if we're not challenging who is holding the power and how these regulations are getting made and who gets to make these decisions, frankly, none of this is going to change. So in my personal opinion, voting and protesting and boycotting and affecting political change is frankly one of the best ways to make change in this industry, because the politicians that we elect are the ones who are deciding upon these trade policies, and they also are deciding upon these corporate policies that basically determine what these large corporations are going to be able to get away with. So that is my slight little pitch, and I'm happy to jump into Q&A.
Great. On that, so on a similar note, and then I think maybe we'll transfer over to the Q&A pretty soon as well, because there's great questions. It looks like some were already answered, but what I was curious, jumping off of what you were just mentioning at the end, Rachel, was, you know, in some countries, they are making a lot of progress. In France, for example, it's the only country, I believe, still in the world that has implemented an extended producer responsibility. So what they're doing is putting the onus on the companies to be responsible for their waste. So they can no longer, which a lot of companies do practice, burning extra fabrics. So do you think, you know, I would be curious what our panelists Barbara, Jenny, and Rachel, what either your companies are doing or what you're thinking, we as individuals, so we can make an impact and encourage our representatives by who we vote for and protesting and speaking out to implement policy changes. But do you think as a consumer, not purchasing that $6 shirt is really going to affect change, or are we really going to have to be putting more pressure on from a legislative perspective?
I can start with that. I think it's a both and. I don't think it's one or the other. I think our own personal choices are what actually affect cultural change, and that affects political change. So it's really important to both be practicing what we preach as well as putting pressure on the bigger system. I think one thing that I don't agree with is how I think the environmental movement in the last couple of 15 years, 2 decades, it's really put a lot of responsibility on individual consumers when the corporations and governments actually have a lot of power to change these things and choose not to. And by sort of bypassing that responsibility onto the consumer, when in reality, like if you went into Walmart and all the products on Walmart shelves were recyclable or were sustainable in some way, then that's what you would buy if you had the money or not. Like if you didn't have a lot of money, you would buy that thing because that would be what was available to you, right? And Walmart could make that decision, but they don't. They absolutely have the power and the money to do it. So my feeling is like it's kind of a both and. And also like speaking from like a small brand, like actually if someone chooses to not buy a $6 shirt from Shein and then they come in and maybe they choose not to buy like really 10 $6 shirts from Shein and they buy one shirt from us instead, well, you've had like a double impact there because you've avoided purchasing 10 badly made things, and then you've invested that money into a small brand that's like every single for small companies like us, like every single one of those purchases absolutely does make a difference. It funds our work, it fuels us to do what we're doing. So it doesn't not have an impact, but it has to be, I think, both ways, like holding the people who are in power accountable, but also for ourselves, it's like when we can make a better choice, then yes, we should absolutely do that when we have the power to do so.
Barbara, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I totally agree. It's basically, I'm just going to echo what Rachel just said. I think that's all true. And I'm smaller than small. I'm like micro. So, not, choosing to buy something from me is a big deal. And I agree, if it means that you're not buying something from Amazon, it is, even better. So, yeah, I think it was just perfectly said. I think that's all we need to say, or that's all that I need to say on that. Rachel said it best.
Jenny, I know Patagonia is a big company, and they're really making a lot of strides and efforts as well to really take on a lot of the responsibility of making these changes.
Yeah. I loved what everyone said so far. I think Patagonia is an interesting place where we really want others to follow our lead. So we're more about like the bigger picture as far as getting other brands to have the same hold companies and manufacturers to the same standards, so that other brands also demand that. And if there's more demand, then other factories are gonna, up there, just get everything's gonna get in the same standards as far as all that goes. But I do think it's interesting because Patagonia, like we had like an ad taken out of the New York Times that said, "Don't buy this jacket." Like, I think it's interesting because the founder and the CEO of the company comes from a mind of like, live really simply. Like, you need one jacket, like who cares if it's dirty? And I think it's really hard sometimes for people to wrap their head, especially maybe people that want like new, nice things, because repairing your jacket and maybe you have like a patch on it, that might kind of look bad to some people. But as far as like someone commented in the comments, like wearing it with a badge of honor, like it'd be great if we could change our outlook on things that are repaired and worn over and over again are obviously more important, and where your clothing is made and how it comes from, you know, where it comes from is obviously so important. But I'm just hoping that Patagonia can keep the course, so that other big companies owned by like Vanity Fair, for instance, like North Face, and, you know, other companies that are also environmentally minded. But yeah, it is a little bit of an uphill battle. So the legislation is definitely like the one go-to, and like where you're banking and where you're spending your money and voting rights. That's why it's such a big deal. So anyways.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and to be clear, when I talk about big corporations, I'm not talking about Patagonia. They're pretty much the only exception to that rule.
I figured as much. We're actually a lot smaller of a company than people like realize, because we're still privately owned and everything. We're not, you know, so we just became like a $1 billion company a few years ago. So that's not a lot compared to the bigger companies. But anyway.
Great, thank you. No, it's really interesting to hear all of your perspectives and experiences within this industry. I'd love to go ahead and try and answer some of these from the Q&A as well. And then I think we'll be wrapping up. I do want to mention as well, we're going to be sending out additional resources that both the Nutrier students put together and we put together. I know there's so many things that are happening and that we can, you know, resources. So hopefully we'll be able to keep adding to that at some point as well. Yeah, one really important point that was brought up, and is also another aspect of this, is when you're washing your clothes. So picking fabrics maybe that are better for washing, but then, yeah, what kind of impact do microplastics and fibers have for the environment as well through washing?
I think Patagonia has led the way on this one. So Jenny, I think that's a good question.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it is a major problem, and it's not something to be overlooked. So fleece like this, like I'm wearing, you know, you wash it, it gets in the washing machine, it goes in our water, like the microplastics, but it also is like all those Lululemon like yoga pants and Amazon yoga pants, and, you know, all that too also has the microplastics. And I will say, you know, Patagonia partnered with a German company to make a bag, like a washing bag that you can put your clothes in so that it catches all that nastiness, the plastics. So I have one of those and I use it every time I wash a lot of my stuff. And obviously I try to air dry as much as I can, but it's called Guppy Friend. I could probably put the link or share it, but it's called Guppy Friend. And it is expensive. Like it's a $35 bag, washing bag. So most people aren't going to buy that. I would say the best thing to do is to wash your clothes less. If you can't afford to buy something like that, or just, you know, be really mindful of it. There's also a coral ball. I think that Carolyn, you're going to share some resources, but there's also a ball that you can put in your washing machine that collects the microplastics, because it's a major problem. And that's why, you know, natural fibers like cotton and wool and even recycled wool and, you know, are better than like the synthetic microplastic clothing. So yeah, it's definitely a problem. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, and to add to that too, just in general, there's a huge carbon footprint of washing clothes, any kind of clothes. And so, you know, it's really, I think, like looking at, you know, what type of fabric it is, and then what are the proper like washing instructions. Some companies, they're kind of lazy and they literally just put dry clean only on everything, but actually that's not accurate. Like silk, for example, can be hand washed. Wool can be hand washed, but unfortunately, like the company just doesn't want to take any responsibility, so they just put dry clean only. So doing your own research on what types of fibers can be washed in different types of ways Basically washing as little as possible. If you can avoid it, hang drying your clothes. Those are all ways to massively reduce your carbon footprint in regards to your clothing. I've heard that sometimes up to 70% of a garment's carbon footprint actually comes from how we take care of it, which would suggest that actually manufacturing is pretty small in comparison. So yeah, basically like that's on us, like keeping your clothes as long as you can, washing them as little as possible, hanging to dry, and using the correct washing method so that you can preserve the life of the clothes.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that about the dry clean only label as well. So thank you for that too. Okay, last, I think we'll wrap it up with this. I'm going to combine two in one about, you know, even if you're still shopping online, so consumer to consumer marketplace type of secondhand clothes, ThreadUp, Poshmark. There's a couple others that we mentioned in our resource that we'll be sharing via email and on our website. You know, what are your thoughts on these type of sites along and or clothing rental options like Rent the Runway?
I'll jump in if that's okay. So I think that rental and thrift is really interesting because I think it has taken on somewhat of the mindset of fast fashion as well, where I think like people think that it's like this end all be all, like, oh, as long as it's secondhand, it's fine. But unfortunately, all the stuff that was produced in the fast fashion industry is now going into those platforms as well. And they still don't last very long, and they still are too trendy, and they still are going to wear out quickly. And a lot of times, I know for myself, when I used to do a lot of thrift shopping when I was in college, and I was like, oh, it's fine as long as I thrift it. But I would buy all these things I actually didn't need, and I was still kind of applying that same shopping mentality. And ultimately, it still kind of creates a demand for fast fashion, and it creates this pipeline. But if that stuff doesn't stay in our closet for a long time and get used, it's ultimately still going to be ending up in a landfill more quickly. So I think that preventing overproduction and minimizing the amount that we buy, period, and making sure that we're buying fewer, better things, whether it's thrifted or not, is really the most important thing. And then I think, you know, in regards to rental, you know, I mentioned this in the comments, but I think that rental can be really good if it's you're purchasing something for a special occasion that you're like, well, I don't need to buy a brand new dress. And I'm only going to wear it once. I think rental is really good for that. What I would say it's not good for is if, you know, there are these new sites that are coming out where it's like you get a box every month and you get to try on all these clothes, and like you send it back and it's all shipped in plastic, and there's this massive footprint of dry cleaning it and shipping it around and all this stuff. That's where I think it starts to just play into the same models. It just, as a fun fact, Rent the Runway is the biggest dry cleaning company in the world. So every single piece of their clothing is dry cleaned every time that somebody wears it once. So it's kind of not a perfect solution. I think at the end of the day, we really need to be more mindful about the way we purchase and ultimately try to prevent overconsumption and allowing so much stuff that is really unnecessary to get produced in the first place.
I also, I agree with a lot of that. I think there's a little bit of a difference in terms of like your socioeconomic situation and age. So I have a lot of teenagers that come into my shop, and as much as at the point that I am in my life, I am willing to spend some money for a quality piece of clothing that I know that I'm going to keep for literal decades. That's okay with me. And I know that that's not happening with a 15-year-old. I know that there's a need for clothing that kids think is trendy, that lets them sort of, show their own personalities, kids that are interested in trends and fashion. And that's a huge part of figuring out who you are when you're a teenager. So as far as that's concerned, thrifting is, I mean, I'm like secondhand. I think thrifting is the way to go. If you are not in a position where you can spend the money that it would take to have a piece that, you know, is really a quality thing that you want to have for decades. So that's my only 2 cents. I certainly agree with a lot of it. I don't love the rent the runway things either. I think we all need to get more comfortable with wearing our clothes a lot more. And like washing way less. And people get so grossed out when I talk about this. I have 3 boys. I have the grimiest house in the world. But I just, you don't need to wash your jeans very much. You don't. Most people wear underwear. You don't need to wash your sweaters unless you're spilling on them, your coats, your blazers, so we just need to get used to new habits so that they seem normal and they don't seem weird. When I talk about I've talked about not washing clothes as often and people react like it's a really disgusting thing. And I just think more of us need to talk about it or something and make new habits so that it just becomes the norm.
I'd love to just jump in here real quick and say, yes, for lifestyle clothing, less washing is more, but technical clothing, Patagonia just definitely encourages you wash so that zippers and things work properly on like technical clothing. So a lot of people think not washing it's better, but actually if you don't wash it, that's when it can break and materials can break down and it lasts less long. So that's kind of just like a funny thing, but overall, yes, washing less is good. And also if you go to our Denver store, we're piloting a rental program for like our snow gear. I know this is not fashion, but like if you're going skiing once a year with your family, you don't need everybody to have ski gear. Like that's ridiculous. You can rent. And I know Patagonia is working on someday, we just piloted like a rental online, but we're really more of an environmental company and not as much of a tech company yet. So we haven't gotten it, but if you go to our Denver store, you can rent ski gear, which is cool.
And we also do at Tonle, we actually do take back clothes. So we have a circularity program where people can, like if they are, done with their previous thing and they don't want it anymore, it doesn't fit or whatever reason, that's another thing too. Like we talked a little bit about size inclusivity, but when people are, when their body shape is changing a lot, like a lot of times that's another reason why, sometimes ethical fashion can be more unaccessible. If you're pregnant and your body is changing a lot over like a year, I think thrifting can also be a really good option for that. So I didn't mean to say like thrifting is all bad. I think it's just being mindful about how we consume in general. And sometimes thrifting is for sure the best option. It's definitely better than purchasing, so many brand new clothes. But I think in general, like being conscious and mindful about how we go about that. And I like the ski rental, that's brilliant. It's things like that where it's like, no, not everyone needs to have a set of ski clothes, or, if you're going on even one of my friends was going on a tropical vacation and she doesn't live in a tropical place. So she rented like a box of like tropical clothes and, for her vacation. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense, to me. So I think it's just about, it is about the appropriateness of the model for the situation. So, yeah.
Great. Well, I think it's time to wrap up. That was really informative, and thank you so much, everyone, all the panelists, students, everyone. You had so much knowledge, and it's really, really helpful to know what's going on and what we can do about it. So thank you again. And just a reminder, we'll be sending out an email with follow-up resources and information. The recording we're going to put on our YouTube page as well. So I didn't know if Beth Drucker had anything to add, or we can just say good night to everyone and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you will keep in mind that we have webinars at least once a month all year long on a variety of topics. We'd love to have you back again. So with that, we'll stop the recording and you can share this this webinar with others, direct them to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.